Hello, welcome back to Path to Wellness with Miriam. Today is part 2 of my faith journey series, and I am talking about the Baptist church that I went to through basically my junior high and high school years. So the first thing after leaving the Presbyterian church, which I talked about in my last video, I started feeling excited about church for the first time. I remember we visited and I could actually understand the sermon. Wow. Anyway, the pastor had this outline, and he had the outline for adults with words missing. He had the sermon notes for kids, and they had words missing, but the first letter of each word was there, blanks for each letter. So you could see how many letters were in the word. So I was able to figure out what words were missing, and that was really fun to fill that in, and it kept me engaged and listening. But then it also was just down to earth, simple language, and I was able to understand it. And I remember my parents early on, after we visited maybe a few times, they had the pastor over, and I remember I was so excited. I was like, yay, Pastor Paul's coming over. And my dad's kind of like, why is she so excited? And he was like, do you want to sit with us and listen while we talk? And I was like, oh no, I'd rather watch a movie with my brothers, or whatever we were doing. I'm just excited. And I think it was God. Looking back, I realized, I think my eyes were being opened, and I was starting to understand and starting to hear God's voice through sermons and through church, and hearing God's voice through other people. And so I was really excited to be hearing messages and understanding messages, understanding sermons. It was just so amazing to me. I was really challenged to grow and serve in this church. One of the things I remember doing is choir. My mother joined the choir, and at some point, I don't remember how old I was, I started singing in the choir. And this church was mostly full of old people, and the choir was all old people, and my mother was very obviously the youngest person in the choir. So when I joined, I was the youngest besides my mother, who was the youngest. So but it was just so sweet, and I loved singing the hymns, and we sang a lot of old hymns, and we sang newer worship songs, but definitely not new cutting edge kind of worship. They're kind of a little bit behind the times, if you get it, but I just really enjoyed being there. I loved singing. I loved worship, whether I was in the choir or in the congregation. I started going to youth group. The youth group was for junior high and high school. And I just remember there were a lot of fun and games that we played. We had worship times, and we sang newer songs than what we sang in church. So we sang stuff like Shout to the Lord, Holiness, is what I long for. I'm trying to remember the other ones. Some of them were a little bit older, I've Got Peace Like a River. It was a lot of fun. And then there were the lessons. We would break up, and usually the junior high, which was almost all girls. I think there was one junior high boy, and he would just hang out with the high school boys. So it's kind of like junior high girls, and then high school girls, and high school boys. And in our small groups, we would discuss the lesson, and that way it could be a little more tailored. Because the junior high girls, especially me, I didn't even have a boyfriend yet. And so when we talked about different, topics, obviously it would be a lot different for the younger set than the older set. Another thing that I started doing was I joined Awana as a leader. Now, I had never gone to Awana as a kid, but I started going through their leader in training program. And in our Awana club, what the leader did is she gave us the first handbook that the kids were working with. So the book, I think the kindergarten, the Sparks. It was the first Sparks handbook. And we had to work through that ourselves. And that was awesome because I learned all the memory verses, and because I was older, I was memorizing them faster than the kids. So I had already memorized the verses that I was helping then the Sparks work on memorizing. It ended up just being a lot of fun. I loved working with them. Later on, I think once I was in high school, I started working also with the TNT, which is like the older group, I think the 3rd through 6th graders. I think I started working with them at some point because of the way youth group was, that I could skip like the games in youth group and stay longer at Awana. Anyway, I don't remember all the details. I really felt like I was hearing God's voice through other people, because there's some key people in the church, like the associate pastor's wife, who would impress these things. Like, why don't you be an Awana leader? Like, I think you should go to Mexico on the missions trip. And I actually went. Like, I went. It was so scary to me. Mexico was the first time I was ever away from home without like my parents or grandparents. I was gone for a whole week. My brother was there, but he didn't want me tagging along all the time. We went down and we helped out. We did a vacation Bible school for kids down in Mexico. We helped build a church. I don't think I was that much help. We played with kids. When people were building the church, I do remember I was on trash duty. There was a lot of trash around the village. And so we kind of went around and we picked up the church, the church grounds that we were building. We picked up like the trash around there and around the field. We burned a lot of trash. That's what they did down there. Yeah, that's really awful. It's smelly. It's probably super toxic. It was probably awful. Anyway, thankfully I only had a few days of that. After Mexico, I went to a youth conference, learning about evangelism and apologetics, and we did like some street evangelism, which was totally scary, to go up to total strangers and start talking to them. I mean, that's really not something I did growing up. I was homeschooled, so I wasn't used to really meeting people outside of like hanging out at my mom's elbow and meeting people and being introduced to people that way. So it was definitely stretching me a lot. After that, like, I then started going to camp. I worked my first year when I was 15. Anyway, I worked as a kitchen staff, and I had a pretty good time, but do you know what? To be honest, I was more homesick than probably 3/4 of the kids at the camp. I cried like 2 or 3 days, nights. Yeah, it was really rough on me and really stretching. But then I came back the next year and I was there for a week as a counselor, and I loved it. Being a counselor was way busier and way more exciting. I didn't have any time really to cry except for like late at night. And there was only, I think, one night where I cried just because I was homesick, and I cried very quietly so the kids wouldn't realize I was crying. But it was an awesome experience, and it was when God was really like working in my life, where I was maturing in my faith, where I was deciding for myself like what I believed in, and learning things like that God is holy and magnificent and awesome and mighty, and just seeing more in depth what those are, what the characteristics of God are, what God's plan is, what God's plan of salvation is, learning to share that plan of salvation with other people and lead them to Christ, seeing how different people worship in different ways, you know, as we visited churches, but then also going to this church, seeing how people worship at camp or down in Mexico, learning to sing, you know, Tengo Paz Como Rio. You know, I know my Spanish is bad, but we learned a little Spanish so we could sing it. And it was just a really like cool time in my life of learning and growing And I would say that time was very characterized by me hearing God's voice through other people. You know, I also had kind of a crisis of faith, I know, where I remember at one point like laying in bed and being like, what if this is all made up? Like, what if God isn't real and my parents just think he's real and everybody just thinks he's real? And so I wrestled with and dealt with questions like that and overcame them and realized, wait a moment, if God isn't real, then why do I see miracles? Like, why do I hear of miracles? But also, why do I see them in my own life? Like, I see the goodness of God in my own life, the ways he's blessed me and protected me, and this is not just all circumstance. I would see baptisms happening, and when I was about 15, I kept on like feeling, and I realized it was God speaking to me. It's like, you should be baptized. And I would sit there watching the baptism and be like, but I am baptized. I was baptized by sprinkling. And I felt that like over and over again. And so I realized I needed to be baptized. So I was baptized by submersion. And after I was baptized, that feeling went away. Like when I saw other baptisms after that, I never felt again like I should be baptized. So I really think that it was God speaking to me, and I don't feel like you have to be baptized by submersion for it to be, quote, real. But for me, that's when my baptism became real. It's when I rededicated my life to Christ. And, you know, all this awesome stuff was happening. I also became a church member. And at our church, no one became a member until they were an adult, because that's when they could vote at church meetings. If you were a minor, you couldn't vote at church meetings. And the pastor was kind of like, why do you want to become a member? And I said, well, because I believe in leadership and I believe in the church. And I want to say that I believe in the church and I believe in what they're doing and I trust the leadership. And so I became a member, and I thought that was pretty cool. And then a bunch of stuff changed. So we had a pastor and an associate pastor, and they both left the church. Not because anything really bad happened, but the pastor had been there for 14 years, and the associate pastor, I don't know how long he'd been there, but he'd been there as long as we'd been there. And they said that they were expecting that the church would have grown more and that the church couldn't support two pastors, but also that the senior pastor, he felt like God was calling him to go do something else. So he ended up like totally moving away. And then the associate pastor, we actually asked like, well, do you want to be our senior pastor? And he didn't really feel like that was God's plan. And so he ended up moving on. This was extremely devastating to me because these men and their families had such a big impact in my life. They had really changed me. They had challenged me to grow in my faith, to take steps out and do things that were scary, like going to Mexico. We also went through a lot of changes because our associate pastor's wife and our senior pastor were both involved in our youth group and Sunday school classes as well. So when they left, we went through a lot of different youth leaders. I remember just like different people substituting. I remember my dad stepping in substituting and someone else's dad substituting for, you know, maybe a week or two. Oh, well, I'll do it temporarily. Two different leaders had us go through James when I was in high school. I think the book of James was really important. God wanted us to really have it down. A lot of changes going on. So we had a interim pastor, and I remember that he liked teasing, especially the high schoolers. So he came to our Sunday school class, and I don't remember if he sat in on it or if he taught it for a little while. But anyway, I remember that he was teasing me, you know. I started talking about Matthew. And he was like, ooh, Matthew, you like Matthew? And I'm like, Matthew's my brother. And he's like, oh. So yeah, I had to tell him, and I learned like to stand up for myself and be like, I don't like being teased. I don't find it fun. you know. So he listened, and he really grew on me, and it was really sad because he was called an intentional interim pastor, where he was there for a year, and we looked for another, or I should say, there was like a search committee that was looking for a pastor and interviewing people. So anyway, eventually we got a pastor, and things really changed. I remember somebody, I don't remember if it was the original senior pastor who shared this, but about this like curve about like the growth of a church, that a church grows and then it kind of dies. And so we need this change, and we need a new pastor. I just kind of thought, like, why? Why does this happen? Like, why does the church die? And what's this whole like church growth chart? People really left the church because of all the changes. And this pastor, he had been at other churches, and he kind of had this model of how to grow a church. And he was like, we need to be seeker friendly. We need to be focused on the next 100 people coming through those doors. And so things really started changing. Some of the music started changing. The worship team started changing. There was a girl in our church who started dating someone who was a non-Christian, and she was on the worship team. And that guy that she was dating was asked to play guitar on the worship team. And, you know, I started reading Matt Redman's book about worship and asking, like, can someone lead worship if they are not worshiping God because they are not a Christian and they don't believe in God? This was like their way of bringing him to church, was like, you can play guitar, like, hey, that'd be fun, and otherwise he wouldn't, I guess, come to church. And so they felt like it was like their way of witnessing to him, and I kind of understand that. But what I realized is that you have to worship to lead people in worship, and that if the worship team is not united in Christ and not all believing in Christ, then there's disunity between them, and then it's hard for them to unite the church in worship. I remember that I went and talked to the pastor, and I don't remember the full thing, but he kind of likened, he said, I'm here to help this church heal, and just like an infected wound has to be scraped open, that's what I'm doing. I'm scraping out this infected wound so it can heal. Yeah. Thanks for calling my church an infected wound. Yeah. As a teenager, I didn't understand. I remember telling my dad that. At some point there, I realized I had to withdraw my membership in the church because I didn't agree with this pastor. I didn't agree with what he basically was saying. I mean, not quite, okay? He didn't actually come out and say, you don't matter. The people coming into the church next matter. But when you're saying that the focus is on the seekers, and the people come, the next 100 people coming in the church, and that we have to focus on getting new people in the church, that kind of is how it comes across as. Like, it came across as, you don't really matter. You need to work hard to grow this church. You guys are like an infected wound. Eventually, my family left the church. My dad was on the deacon board, and he actually resigned from the deacon board, and we left the church. I know that this pastor ended up really wounding a lot of people. So it wasn't just me. This kind of ends a sad chapter, you know? At this Baptist church, like, so many great things happened. Like, so many amazing things happened at this church. In fact, to jump ahead a little bit, years later, when I was looking for a place to get married, I decided to get married at this church because it had played such a big role in my life. And by that time, there was not this pastor. There was a totally new pastor, and he seemed to be very awesome, and I liked meeting with him. And I was very thankful that I could get married in that church that had all those wonderful memories from junior high and high school. Obviously, there was a lot of hurt too. Some of it was really the other people that really got hurt. And anyway, so I hope that you will watch the next segment